Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Turkey, the strategically located $800 billion economy which straddles east and west. And it's got a new president. But will the former Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan be able to protect Turkey from the gathering economic storm clouds? Also this week, Africa, we talk bailouts, balance sheets and even babies with the CEO of South Africa's Standard Bank as predictions grow for the continent's future population. And a break for the border. A nighttime contraband crackdown is causing headaches for Venezuela and Colombia as cheap food and gas heads over the border for huge profits. So, we're looking at Turkey this week, where scenes of jubilation welcomed a new president, who is, of course, the old Prime Minister. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has popularity, there is no doubt about it. And in this presidential poll, he won outright with 52% of the vote. But his success is rooted in past economic good times, and economists reckon Turkey's future under an Erdogan presidency is far from clear. Turkey's $800 billion economy remains among the 20 biggest in the world, but the IMF says it's not built on a sustainable model. Here's why. You go back to 2013 and Turkey was actually in a group which we label the Fragile Five. Morgan Stanley came up with that. Economies which were too hooked on foreign cash injections. Then there's the central bank, which is worried about inflation, but Erdogan wants low interest rates. And if that carries on, we could see a debt bubble in the private sector. There's the battles with the media. You might remember this, Erdogan's attempted clampdown on Twitter and YouTube, the type of autocratic tendencies that could spell trouble ahead. And of course, geopolitical events outside of Turkey. It borders both Syria and Iraq, two of the most unstable countries in the region right now. But none of the fears about the future were on display from the new leader. He spoke instead of a new era.
Kardeşlerim, gönülden ifade ediyorum.
Brothers, I say this from the heart. Let's start a new social reconciliation period today, and let's leave the old discussions in the old Turkey. Let us leave tensions, culture of clashes and virtual problems in old Turkey.
So is Turkey's economy at some sort of defining crossroads? We'll talk about that now. Joining us from Istanbul, Professor Kerem Alkan, who is an economist and the rector of the Nisantazi University in Turkey. Professor, you wrote after Mr. Erdogan's victory, I'm going to quote you here, Erdogan's victory ensures the political stability in Turkey, which is a key issue for economic stability. That's very true. You know, the two things are obviously vital for each other. But is this just Mr. Erdogan relying on past success? People think it's been good, so we'll stay with him for stability.
On the stability part, we can say that especially the businessman part of the Turkish maybe electors, they prefer to continue with President Erdogan because on the last 12 years, his performance showed that there is a clear good governance on the economic administration with his team. In this team, as you know, we have the Deputy Prime Minister Babacan, the Minister of Finance Mehmet Şimşek, so and the Central Bank and the Treasury. We have to not forget them. We saw a clear good governance on the Turkish economy.
Even though you've talked about stability there, is there not a potential problem given Mr. Erdogan wants to keep growth going by keeping interest rates low? But then the central bank will also be worried about inflation problems after that.
The current Deputy Prime Minister Babacan maybe will not be as the member of the new government, and also because of this, perhaps we will see that the governor of the central bank could change. But these rumors are not acceptable for the business life and the financial markets in Turkey because there is a geopolitical risk for Turkey because of Iraq, Syria and Ukraine, Russia problems. And also at that moment, the Federal Reserve will begin to increase his political rates. So that's why people need to see Ali Babacan for the next 9 months for all kind of economical, financial and geopolitical risk. But unfortunately, there is a high rumor at that moment on the markets. So the next 2 weeks will be so interesting for Turkish economy exactly.
Professor Kerim Alkan, talking Turkey with us this week on Counting the Cost. We thank you for your time, sir.
It's a pleasure to be on Al Jazeera.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, a look inside the often hidden world of commodity trading. We'll talk about what really drives the prices of the world's raw materials like silver with the author of the book, The Secret Club That Runs the World. We're looking at Africa though right now, and a new report with some pretty amazing numbers. Try this. By the end of this century, so we're talking 85 odd years from now, 1 in 4 babies will be born in Africa. 25% of all births happening on one continent. So what does that mean though? Opportunity and prosperity, or more economic strain? Malcolm Webb has more.
This Ugandan baby takes her first breaths. Today she just wants to be held and fed, but along with tens of thousands of babies born in Africa every day, in the coming years she's going to want an education and then a job. Africa's youth population is booming, and so across the continent people are wondering what the future will bring.
The first thing that these people are going to be looking for will be jobs. So what they need to do is actually focus on going to school first, like getting their degrees and diplomas and certificates in order to get proper jobs.
I think governments need to build more industries so that there can be more job opportunities in urban areas.
The United Nations projects that by the end of the century, 4 out of 10 people will be African. It says even by 2050, around 41% of the world's births will be in Africa. And most of those will be in Nigeria, where it will account for almost 1/10 of the world's births. Its most populous city, Lagos, is already the largest in the continent, and more than 1/3 of young adults living there are unemployed. In March, tens of thousands attended a mass recruitment in a stadium for a handful of government jobs. It ended in a stampede and 7 people were killed. But the UN Children's Fund says Africa's youth boom could lead to huge economic growth and prosperity if governments invest now in education, healthcare and creating more jobs.
We are optimistic about Africa's future, but only if those investments are made and if those investments start to be made now, because it will take, for many of those investments, possibly a generation for them to be fruitful. But unless that happens, Africa's very young children now, in 20 years' time, when they're beginning to enter the labour force, may face a very uncertain future.
And so the future for the continent's millions of babies hangs in the balance. It's the decisions of the leaders today that will determine their chance to succeed tomorrow.
And as if to underline the strains which already exist in Africa, we had the news of South Africa's central bank having to rescue one of its biggest low-cost lenders from collapse. Africa Bank Investments made high-interest loans to working-class South Africans who lacked the assets to borrow from traditional banks. Actually, many of its 3.2 million customers were miners who couldn't pay back debts because of the mine strikes. The bank also owned a furniture store. That could close with 8,000 job losses there. What's unusual, though, is that a group of South Africa's largest private banks are going to fund this billion-dollar bailout. One of them is Standard Bank, and its co-CEO Sim Chabalala is with us this week from Johannesburg. Sim, it is interesting that the private banks are the ones who will bail out Africa Bank Investments. Just explain to us, A, why that is the case, and B, why it was so important to save this bank.
Really, Kamal, it's an illustration of the maturity of the South African financial system. If one looks at the press release issued by the governor on Sunday, it's very clear that the central bank, working together with African Bank and a consortium of banks, as well as the National Treasury, have stepped in to resolve a potentially difficult situation, and they've done so in an orderly fashion.
And I guess the fact that this was a slightly different bank is one that specifically was there to help out low-income earners and people who'd been, caught out by problems with the miners' strikes as well. This is a large portion of society, and I guess it's important that, how do I phrase this here, that, the little man isn't left out in amongst all these big banking deals.
Yes, and the way the arrangements have been structured is such that the organization will continue to provide lending to that segment of the market.
OK, then, let's get on with what happened to your bank, Standard Bank. Your interim profit numbers for this year, you've talked about, I've seen in a news release here, total income growing by a pleasing 12%, you called it, which is good, I guess, in this sort of economic environment. But you've talked about the strong growth in your rest of Africa options, or operations even. Tell us where exactly the good performances have been.
So the operations in the rest of Africa, the operating income grew by 34%. And the vectors of that were this: increased lending, better deposits, bigger retail deposit base, good transactional activity as a consequence of an increased number of good retail customers, good activity in business banking, strong revenues from the transactional products and services business, the one that does trade finance, cash management, and so forth, and good revenues from our global markets and our investment banking business. So all in all, it's illustrating how strong the African operations are, which now constitute a third of the group's income.
Okay, and what about in South Africa itself, your home base and your biggest market, I would say?
The South African operations also contributed quite nicely on all the line items that I've just referred to, albeit at a slower pace than the rest of the African continent. Of course, Kamal, as you know, a bank grows on the basis of growth in GDP. GDP in South Africa is below 2%, whereas in the rest of the continent it's above 5 to 6%. And the second vector of that growth is banking penetration, an increasing number of products and services. The South African market is far more mature than the markets to the north of South Africa.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you to explain to our viewers actually why this South African market is slow, because you're saying the market is, you know, the word you've used is mature. It's already grown, I guess, while the rest of the continent is coming off a lower base and has got lots more room to grow. Is it maturity in South Africa, or are there unique problems there?
It's both of the above. South Africa's growth is capped at about 3%. Its medium-term growth is capped at about 3% by our infrastructure challenges, particularly in power generation and electricity. That, however, is being addressed. For example, Medupe is going to be coming on stream, I understand, by the end of this year. Once you unlock the infrastructure blockages, the country grows at above 3%, and there's all the evidence that the major projects necessary for that purpose are being implemented and executed, including our ports and our roads. If you add to that the discovery of oil and gas, of gas on the east coast and in the interior of the country, our economists say you could add 1% to 2% to the country's GDP. And so it is possible to conceive of an outcome of GDP growth above 5% for South Africa. But it's subject to us as a country implementing sound policies.
And this is the very thing. South Africa, and actually all of Africa really, needs to think about that. You know, we had that report earlier in the show about UNICEF and its numbers, which said by the end of the century we're going to be looking at a quarter of all the world's births coming from Africa alone. There will be so many people, and if that can be harnessed properly and developed properly, if the capacity is there and the opportunity is there, it's all happening.
Oh, come on, absolutely. Africa is going to have a large population with a large proportion of which will be of working age. If we get our demographic dividend and enjoy the benefits of that demographic dividend, we're headed for great growth. That demographic dividend, I think, will be enjoyed if and only if we implement proper education systems, better health systems, deepen the infrastructure, roll out roads, increase our power generation, and then also deepen our the institutions and make them less extractive. That way we will benefit from this demographic dividend.
Sim Chabalala from Standard Bank in South Africa. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Many thanks, Kamal.
To Latin America now, and a quite fascinating move by the governments of Venezuela and Colombia. They're trying to curb smuggling by closing their border crossings at night. But we're not talking about drugs or people smuggling here. Rather, everyday goods like food and gasoline. They're subsidized in Venezuela heavily, and there's a dramatic price difference which leads to the smuggling into Colombia. Look at these numbers. A litre of gas, first of all. It costs under 2 cents in Venezuela, though it may be forced to put those prices up. Still, it's $1.12 over in Colombia. A kilo of corn flour, 20 cents in Venezuela, $1.25 in Colombia. And here is the extraordinary one. A pack of toilet paper. It costs Venezuelans 80 cents. It costs Colombians $8.75. And so what about these efforts to halt the smuggling? Well, Alessandro Rampietti went on a night run with the soldiers policing the frontier in Venezuela's Táchira state.
On the lookout for smugglers. Since last Monday, the Venezuelan government has sent thousands of soldiers along the border with Colombia. They're shutting down legal crossings at night to patrol secret paths they say traffickers use to move massive amounts of Venezuelan subsidized goods into Colombia. It's what they believe is to blame for shortages in the country. Lieutenant Colonel Luis Perez Martinez runs the operations.
We've identified hundreds of paths and are trying to disable them. Closing the official border makes it easier to patrol clandestine spots.
Tonight they're entering one axis from the town of San Antonio del Táchira. The soldiers move fast along the dirt road, weapons in hand, searching for evidence.
The Venezuelan army engineers have been digging holes like this one across the paths throughout the border region to try and stop the passage of cars or motorcycles.
Many critics accuse the Venezuelan army of being corrupt and allowing the smuggling to go on, something the colonel rejects.
These are false accusations. The truth is, thousands of soldiers are putting their lives at risk against criminals.
The presidents of the two countries recently agreed to cooperate against smuggling with joint military operations. But Colombia says the nighttime closing of the border was not part of that plan and is hurting the economy and the freedom of the people.
This is a unilateral decision by Venezuela's government. We don't believe that closing the border will control contraband.
Venezuela seems to be ready to do all in its power to stop the loss of goods at the border. But while the gaping difference in prices and policy between the two countries remain, few believe restrictions alone are going to solve the problem.
And a story like that really underlines how the most basic commodities in the world are often the most sought after and the most abused. Our next guest says she was only half joking when she used the term the secret club that runs the world to describe these trading houses that set the prices of the world's basic goods. But Kate Kelly's investigations have given her access to commodity trading's inner circle, and she joins us now from New York. Kate, if I walked into a bookstore and I saw that title, I would probably think, well, we pick on Goldman Sachs all the time, don't we? But Goldman Sachs, investment banks and the likes of this thing, Wall Street. Most would think that is the secret club that runs the world. What is the secret club you refer to?
Well, to be fair, Goldman Sachs does play an important role in this book, and as does Morgan Stanley. So the banks are part of the secret club, I would argue. But essentially, Kamal, what I'm talking about is there's a group of commodity traders. These are people who essentially make professional bets on where oil is going to trade a year from now or 6 months ago, what the price will be in the real world markets. And they use something called the futures markets, which is kind of the commodity equivalent of the stock market, if you will, to place those bets. So there are hedge funds. They are portions of the banks. They are large physical trading firms. You may have heard names like Glencore, Vitol, Mercuria. These are some examples of what I hyperbolically, of course, but with a grain of truth, call the secret club that runs the world. Yeah,
but what are they doing? Or rather, what are they doing that means they run the world in this sense?
Well, what they do is they place these bets on where they think the future prices of commodities will be. But what tends to happen is these bets, once accumulated, can actually move prices. Now, in the vast majority of cases, I don't think that there's anything untoward going on here, but the impact can be real. So, for example, I have a fellow in my book, a hedge fund trader, who lost a bunch of money in the oil market on a certain day in 2011 at a time when prices were trending lower, and he found that he had to reverse a number of market positions and take them off and sell them, essentially. He estimates, and it's hard to know for sure, but he estimates that his own trading pushed prices down by an additional $2 or $3. So what would have been a $7 move became a $10 move, if you will. That's the kind of situation where you get sort of a pile-on of these professional, if you will, secret club members, and their accumulated bets can move prices up or down. Now, there are also examples where more is considered to be at play by some than simple ideas about where prices may move. There are situations where people buy lots of the physical product. For example, in the cocoa market in 2010, there was an occurrence with one trader who bought a ton of physical cocoa, and prices ended up being affected by that. They went to, I believe, 30-year highs at the time. That's a case where some accused him of deliberately trying to move the markets, and whether it was deliberate or not, he certainly did move the markets, and he could only do it because he was so powerful, well capitalized, and knowledgeable about cocoa that he had the wherewithal to take a position like that.
So then tell us more about who it's affecting. If you're talking about commodities, like, you know, you said cocoa, or you could do grains and oil and things like that, then I'm thinking parts of the world that are less developed, people who are generally poorer, places where they can get exploited. Is that what's happening?
That's absolutely a concern. For example, I talk a little bit about Glencore in the book. Glencore is this huge physical trading company based in Switzerland and founded, of course, by the notorious international figure who died last year, Mark Rich. And one thing that they did that's proved controversial is they were part of a group of companies that bought Zambian assets. I believe it was 2008, at a time when the country was in real economic turmoil, as was much of the rest of the world, of course. And what ended up happening was they were able to harvest those mining assets, minerals and metals that are found in Zambia by taking them out of the ground, essentially, then transporting them to other places for manufacturing use or whatnot. You would have thought that Zambia would have made money on that deal with Glencore and other miners, but instead what's happened is the gain to them has been de minimis, and as a matter of fact, the electricity that they've had to provide to these mining companies as part of their original agreement has lost them money despite the tax revenue they're taking in. The other issue, Kamal, I would point out, perhaps the more typical example is just the price of petrol, right? The price of gas. If speculators, if professional commodity traders are betting that gas will, or rather oil will trend much higher, and oil, of course, is the building block of gas that we use at the pump or auto fuel that we use for airplanes, that may have an effect on pushing prices upward. Back in 2008, in the first half of the year, especially when prices were getting to record highs in commodities and especially oil, there was a great deal of outrage, for example, in the U.S. and in other places as to whether these professional traders were deliberately driving up prices. That's a very everyday example of where these quote-unquote secret club members may have an impact on you and me.
So where's the regulation then, Kate? Because that seems to be the thing that's missing in everything you've said to me. Is this difficult to regulate? Is it easy to find loopholes? What is it?
Very, very difficult to regulate. Very difficult. Now, despite the outrage of rising prices and the theories that many people have that speculators drive up the prices of goods at certain times, and then, of course, the reverse at other times, there's just a lack of will, I think, to really empower the regulators, certainly in the U.S., and I think until recently the same was true in the U.K. as well. China's sort of a different story. I can't promise to give you the full global view, but really in the U.S. where I focus, there's been a lack of a political mandate. The primary commodity regulator here is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, and they've always had a very small budget, very small staff relative to the SEC. It's only recently that we're starting to see more. So I think that the direction is moving in favor of greater regulation, but up until certainly the financial crisis and even the mandate that we had then took a while to implement. There just hadn't been as much will as you might expect.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/programs. The Counting the Cost page has individual reports, links and entire episodes as well for you to catch up on, as well as a social media feed of people's comments and feedback. Of course, you can join in that if you like. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. There's our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well, or drop us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. I am off on holiday, so someone else will be looking after you while I'm away. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you in a few weeks. And the news is next on Al Jazeera.